Charles Wilcox threw out a champion mare he swore was Barren, selling her for scrap price to a kill buyer while her stall sat empty. What the ranch hand's 12-year-old son noticed in the dust of the paddock led to a phone call that made a specialist fly 700 miles. And when that mare finally foaled, she produced a champion that embarrassed Charles at the year's biggest show. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment with where you're watching from. Let's go. Charles Wilcox ran the biggest breeding operation in 3 counties. A man whose name opened doors at every auction house and show ring west of the Rockies. His champion black mare, Midnight Sovereign, had carried his colors to more blue ribbons than any horse he'd ever owned. But the moment she failed to conceive 2 seasons in a row, he signed her over to a kill buyer for $800 and never looked back. 12-year-old Michael Torres, the son of Wilcox's lowest-paid stable hand, watched her being loaded onto that trailer. He had been watching her for weeks, and he'd seen something in the way she moved when they brought the teaser stallion near her stall. Everyone said she was worthless, her bloodline dead, but Michael had noticed something the ranch vet had missed twice. The question that would turn everything upside down was simple. Was the mare truly Barren, or had negligence worn the label that should have been pinned on her handlers? The Wilcox Ranch sprawled across 1,200 acres of prime Colorado grassland, a kingdom of white fencing and custom-built stables that turned out champions like an assembly line. Charles Wilcox had inherited the operation from his father, who had inherited it from his father. And over 3 generations, the family had built a reputation so sterling that their brand alone added 5 figures to any horse's asking price. But the operation didn't run on sentiment. It ran on margins, on breeding schedules, on the cold calculus of which mares earned their keep and which ones became liabilities the instant their foaling record showed a 0. Midnight Sovereign had been the crown jewel of the program, a towering black Shire mare with a coat like polished obsidian and a show record that filled an entire wall of the ranch office. She had produced 2 champion foals in her prime, both of them sold for sums that made headlines in the equestrian press. But that was 4 years ago. Since then, she had been bred 5 times across 2 seasons, and 5 times the ultrasounds had come back empty. Charles called her a money pit. The ranch foreman called her a dead end. And on a Tuesday morning in late September, Charles signed the transfer papers that condemned her to a slaughterhouse in Nuevo Laredo. Michael Torres noticed things. It wasn't something he had been taught so much as something he had learned from a childhood spent trying to disappear in a world that didn't want him seen. His father, Antonio, had worked the Wilcox stables for 6 years, mucking stalls and hauling feed for wages that barely covered the rent on the single-wide trailer they shared at the edge of the property. Michael had been allowed to stay on the ranch after school as long as he kept out of the way, which meant he spent hours sitting on tack trunks and fence rails, watching the rhythms of the barn with the silent attention of a boy who knew his presence was tolerated, not wanted. He had learned which horses were sweet and which ones would bite. He had learned the cadence of the breeding shed, the careful choreography of handlers and teaser stallions, and the veterinarians who came every other Thursday to check the mares. And he had learned, over the past 6 weeks, that something was wrong with Midnight Sovereign. Something that didn't match the official story of a mare whose body had simply given up on reproduction. The barn staff had noticed it too, but they had an explanation they were comfortable with. The mare flinched whenever the teaser stallion was brought close, pinning her ears back and shifting her weight in a way that made the handlers tighten their grip on her lead rope. Doc Harlan, the ranch's regular veterinarian, had chalked it up to temperament. Some mares just get sour after too many failed cycles, he had said, wiping his hands on a rag after yet another negative ultrasound. Their hormones turn them mean. Nothing you can do about it. He had recommended selling her before she became dangerous, And Charles, who trusted Doc Harlan's judgment the way a captain trusts his first mate, had nodded and told the foreman to find a buyer. But Michael had spent enough time watching Midnight Sovereign in her stall, in the paddock, being lunged by the grooms, to know that the flinch wasn't meanness. She moved soundly in the field, her massive legs carrying her with the same floating grace she had shown in the show ring years before. She let Michael stroke her muzzle through the stall bars, nickering softly when he brought her the bruised apples he sneaked from the kitchen scrap bucket. The only time she showed distress was when the breeding team approached, and specifically when they touched her flank. Michael didn't know what it meant, but he knew it wasn't just attitude. He had seen a broodmare with ovarian cysts once, a neighbor's horse, and the way she had flinched at the veterinarian's palpation had looked exactly the same. The difference was, that neighbor had called a specialist. Doc Harlan hadn't bothered. On the morning the trailer arrived, Michael stood at the fence and watched them load Midnight Sovereign. Her hooves clanged on the metal ramp, each step a sound that felt like a hammer blow to his ribs. He thought about the bruise-colored sunset he had watched from the paddock fence the night before, the mare standing motionless in the golden light, her dark eyes meeting his across the grass. He had promised her nothing, but the promise formed in his mind all the same. He wasn't going to let her die in a slaughterhouse because nobody had bothered to ask the right questions. The problem was, nobody was going to listen to a 12-year-old stable boy. He needed someone who mattered. Someone who could make the chain of Wilcox's decision-making stop before that trailer crossed the state line. His father was the obvious first step, but Antonio Torres had spent 6 years tiptoeing around Charles Wilcox, terrified of losing his job and the housing that came with it. Going against the boss's decision, especially on behalf of a horse the boss had already written off as worthless, was the kind of move that could get a family evicted overnight. Michael knew that. But as the diesel engine rumbled to life and the trailer began to roll toward the main gate, the cost of doing nothing suddenly felt heavier than any risk his father could name. He ran to the barn, found his father hauling a hay bale from the loft, and the words came out in a flood that surprised them both. He told him about the flinch, about the way the mare moved differently than the other Barren horses, about his memory of the neighbor's mare and the specialist from Fort Collins who had fixed her with a hormone treatment that took less than a week. He said all of it, and then he said the one thing his father couldn't ignore. "If you don't help me stop that trailer, I'm going to the boss myself." Antonio Torres looked at his son for a long moment, weighing the consequences against something he had nearly forgotten existed. The stubborn belief that a child's observation could sometimes see clearer than an adult's certainty. He had raised Michael to keep his head down and his mouth shut, but the same qualities that kept them safe had also kept them invisible, and invisibility had a price. Midnight Sovereign was paying that price right now. Antonio set down the hay hook and walked out of the barn, his son at his heels, and flagged down the trailer driver at the main gate. What happened next required 3 phone calls and a gamble that nearly ended everything before it began. The first call was to Charles Wilcox, who was at an auction in Denver and too distracted to argue for more than 30 seconds before waving his hand and saying the mare was already gone in his mind, but if Antonio wanted to take the problem off his hands, she was his for $800, the same price the kill buyer had offered. The second call was to Doc Harlan, who laughed at the idea that some stable boy had spotted something he had missed and said flatly that bringing a specialist down from Fort Collins would cost more than the mare was worth. The third call was the one that mattered. Antonio, against every instinct, asked his son if he was certain. Michael nodded once, and Antonio dialed a number he had copied from the directory of the local extension office. The office of a board-certified equine reproductive specialist named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had a reputation for taking on the cases that other veterinarians had botched or abandoned. She listened to Antonio's description: the flinching, the clean movement, the 2 years of failed breeding with basic ultrasounds and no hormone panels, and when she spoke, her voice was clipped and unimpressed. But it carried a flicker of something that sounded like professional curiosity. "I can't promise anything," she said, "but if the mare hasn't been given a proper breeding soundness exam, there's a real chance the problem is misdiagnosed. Endometritis, cervical scarring, and ovulatory follicles, all reversible if you catch them. I'm driving down tomorrow. If that trailer leaves the property before I get there, this conversation never happened." Antonio hung up and looked at his son. The trailer engine was still idling at the gate, the driver leaning out his window with a cigarette and an expression of mild annoyance. The mare was standing in the back, her great head visible through the slats, her eyes fixed on the barn as if she knew something was shifting in her favor, but didn't dare believe it. Michael felt his heart hammering in his chest, the weight of having set something enormous in motion suddenly pressing down on him. He had gambled his father's job, their home, their entire fragile standing on the Wilcox ranch, all on a hunch that the adults around him had been too incurious to test. Tomorrow he would find out whether that hunch was worth anything. And if it wasn't, the mare would go to slaughter, and the Torres family would almost certainly go with her. Dr. Alina Vasquez arrived the next morning in a dust-caked SUV that had seen more back roads than paved highways. A woman in her mid-40s with silver-threaded dark hair, pulled back in a practical knot in eyes that scanned the Wilcox property like she was already cataloging everything wrong with it before she'd even stepped out of the vehicle. She had brought more equipment than the ranch had seen in a decade. A portable ultrasound with a probe designed specifically for reproductive imaging, a refrigerated case of collection vials, a centrifuge that hummed to life from the back of her truck, and a digital palpation sensor that measured uterine elasticity in real time. Doc Harlan had arrived too, arms crossed over his barrel chest, making no effort to hide his contempt. He kept calling it a waste of everyone's morning and asking Antonio how he planned to pay for the specialist's fees when the tests came back confirming what he'd already diagnosed with his own 2 hands. Antonio didn't answer. Michael stood 6 feet away, close enough to hear but far enough to feel invisible, the way he always did. His breakfast sat untouched in his stomach. The mare was standing in a holding pen near the barn, her halter clipped to a cross tie, her massive body tense but cooperative. She hadn't been fed yet because Dr. Vasquez had requested a fasting window for the blood panel she intended to draw. Her ears swiveled between the humans, registering the tension without understanding its source. The examination took 40 minutes. Dr. Vasquez worked with the methodical focus of a woman who had spent 20 years untangling reproductive mysteries that lesser clinicians had dismissed as unsolvable. She started with the ultrasound, her eyes fixed on the monitor's grayscale landscape, her free hand resting on the mare's flank, with the gentleness of someone who understood that a horse's trust was not a given, but a negotiation. She murmured to Midnight Sovereign in a low voice, not words anyone could make out, just a rhythmic sound that seemed to slow the mare's breathing and ease the tension in her neck. Michael watched the screen, understanding almost nothing but grasping intuitively that the patterns of light and shadow meant something, that this was not the perfunctory 5-minute scan Doc Harlan had performed every other Thursday without fail. Dr. Vasquez paused, adjusted the probe, and exhaled slowly. "There it is," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. That's the problem. What she had found was not a single issue, but a constellation of them. And none of them had anything to do with permanent infertility. The mare's uterine lining showed evidence of chronic low-grade endometritis, a persistent inflammation that prevented implantation of any fertilized egg by creating an environment too hostile for survival. The condition was treatable with a course of intrauterine antibiotics and a series of lavage procedures that flushed the bacteria from the uterine walls. But that wasn't all. Her hormone panel, processed from the blood draw Dr. Vasquez had taken within the first 10 minutes, revealed a secondary problem that Doc Harlan's basic ultrasounds had never been designed to catch: anovulatory follicles that had built up over multiple cycles, cystic structures that produced just enough progesterone to mimic a functioning reproductive system while quietly preventing actual ovulation. The mare had been cycling in the technical sense, but no egg was ever released. She had been bred 5 times into an oven that was never turned on, and the inflammation had silently worsened with every failed attempt. The flinching that everyone had interpreted as sour temperament was physical pain, the kind of deep pelvic discomfort that accompanied a uterus fighting a bacterial war with no help from its caretakers. Doc Harlan stood very still for a long moment. Then he said something Michael would never forget. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest in a way that cost him something to admit. "I've been pulling ultrasounds for 15 years, and I've never once ordered a hormone panel on a mare that was still showing heat cycles. I didn't think I needed to." He said it to the ground as much as to anyone, and Dr. Vasquez, without looking at him, replied, "That's why the textbooks say 50 to 60% of mares labeled as barren have treatable conditions. Because the basic exams miss half of what's actually happening." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Antonio Torres put his hand on his son's shoulder, not saying anything, but the pressure of his palm communicated what words could not. Michael had been right. The mare was not barren. She had been mismanaged by a system that had no incentive to look deeper when discarding a problem was cheaper than solving one. The relief that flooded through Michael's chest was so intense it made him dizzy, but the relief lasted less than a minute before the next question landed like a bucket of cold water. Treating both conditions would require 2 weeks of daily procedures, specialized medications, and a follow-up plan that stretched months. Dr. Vasquez estimated the total cost at somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000. Antonio didn't have $7,000. He didn't have $700. And Charles Wilcox, who had already written the mare off for $800, was not going to pay anything for her recovery. Not when the economics of his operation demanded that problem mares be removed, not restored. The solution that emerged from that afternoon was improbable, fragile, and entirely dependent on a 12-year-old's refusal to accept that money was an obstacle worthy of surrender. Michael had saved his earnings from 3 summers of odd jobs around the ranch, mending tack and cleaning tack rooms and picking rocks from the paddocks for $1 an hour. He had $216 tucked in a coffee can under his bed, money he had been saving for a used laptop that might help him do his schoolwork without spending every afternoon at the public library 7 miles away. He offered the entire sum to Dr. Vasquez without hesitation, pushing the crumpled bills across the hood of her SUV in a gesture so earnest it made his father turn away. The specialist looked at the money, then at the boy, then at the mare standing in the holding pen behind them. She did not take the cash. Instead, she pulled out her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a veterinary pharmaceutical supplier who owed her a favor. She negotiated a 60% discount on the antibiotics and the lavage solution. The second was to a colleague at Colorado State University who ran a clinical trial on equine reproductive therapies. She arranged for Midnight Sovereign to be enrolled in the study at 0 cost, with the only condition being that Dr. Vasquez would publish the case data if the treatment succeeded. By the time she hung up, the $7,000 had shrunk to a little over $900. And Antonio, who had been standing silently with the posture of a man waiting for an axe to fall, finally spoke up. "That much I can manage," he said, his voice rough. "We can manage." The next 2 weeks transformed the quiet corner of the Wilcox Ranch, where the Torres trailers sat, into a makeshift veterinary clinic. Every morning before sunrise, Michael and his father walked Midnight Sovereign to a small paddock they had cleared behind the storage shed. A patch of ground hidden from the main barn, and the disapproving eyes of the foreman, who had made it clear that this project was Antonio's problem and would not interfere with his regular duties. Dr. Vasquez drove down from Fort Collins 4 times a week to perform the lavage procedures, guiding a sterile catheter through the mare's cervix and flushing her uterus with warm saline solution until the fluid ran clear instead of cloudy. The antibiotics were administered daily through an intramuscular injection that Michael learned to give himself, pressing the needle into the mare's neck with hands that trembled the first 3 times but grew steady by the end of the week. Midnight Sovereign tolerated all of it with a patience that seemed almost preternatural, as if she understood that the discomfort was temporary and the alternative was the slaughterhouse she had escaped by the narrowest of margins. Doc Harlan appeared once, unannounced, on the 5th day. He stood at the fence of the hidden paddock for nearly 10 minutes, watching Dr. Vasquez work, saying nothing. Before he left, he handed Michael a sealed envelope with the words for the mare written on the front in cramped handwriting. Inside was $400 in $20 bills and a note that said, "Should have done the panel. I'm sorry." Michael tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket and didn't mention it to anyone until that night, when he sat cross-legged on his bed and read the note 4 times. Trying to decide whether it made him feel better or worse about everything that had almost happened. But the quiet progress of the mare's recovery was taking place inside a pressure cooker that was building toward explosion. Word had spread through the ranch staff that Antonio had gone behind the boss's back, that the mare Charles had declared worthless was still on the property, still eating feed, still occupying space. The foreman, a man named Garrett, who had risen through the ranks on loyalty rather than competence, had been waiting for an opportunity to prove his value to Charles. And this was it. He had been documenting every minute Antonio spent on the mare, every bale of hay diverted to the hidden paddock, every gallon of water. On the morning of the 8th day, Charles Wilcox returned from Denver sooner than expected, and Garrett was waiting for him at the gate with a clipboard and a list of grievances. Antonio was summoned to the main house at noon. Michael watched his father walk up the gravel path to the ranch office, a small figure against the enormous white columns of the Wilcox family home, and felt a terror so complete it closed his throat. If Charles decided to reclaim the mare now, with the treatment only half finished, the infection would recur and the hormonal dysfunction would never fully correct. The mare would be sold again, this time with a freshly documented record of veterinary intervention that made her more valuable than the $800 Charles had accepted. Valuable enough to attract a buyer who might breed her improperly all over again, and the cycle would start from zero. The past week would be erased. The $400, the specialist's waived fees, the boy's $216, all of it gone. Antonio stood in the ranch office for 40 minutes. Michael, unable to wait, crept to the back of the building where a window had been left cracked open against the autumn heat, and he heard fragments of the conversation that would determine whether their family and the mare survived the day intact. Charles's voice was the dominant instrument, a baritone so accustomed to getting its way that it barely rose above conversational volume even when delivering ultimatums. He said the mare had been sold, technically, but the paperwork had never been filed because Antonio had stopped the trailer before it left the property, and a sale that hadn't been executed could be voided. He said the mare was still his on paper, and if Dr. Vasquez's treatment was working, as Garrett had reported, then the mare was worth substantially more than the nothing Charles had been willing to accept. He said he was willing to refund Antonio's $800 plus $1,000 for the inconvenience and take the mare back effective immediately. Antonio's response, when it came, was so quiet that Michael had to press his ear against the window frame to make out the words. He said the mare wasn't livestock. She was a living animal who had been failed by everyone responsible for her, and if Charles took her back now, before the treatment was complete, she would relapse and die. He said that the $800 had been accepted as payment, that the trailer had been stopped with Charles's verbal approval, and that Dr. Vasquez had already filed an affidavit with the county extension office documenting the mare's condition and the treatment plan, which meant any attempt to reclaim her would create a legal record of veterinary neglect that Charles did not want tied to his name. Antonio had never spoken to his employer like this in 6 years of employment, and the words came out of him like a dam breaking, all the accumulated fear and silence of a man who had finally found something worth risking everything for. Charles stared at him. He was not used to being defied by anyone, let alone his lowest paid, stable hand, and the surprise of it bought Antonio a moment that no argument could have purchased. By the time Antonio walked out of the ranch office, he had won a reprieve, not a victory. Charles had agreed to let the mare complete her treatment, but only on the condition that she be transferred to off-site boarding within 48 hours. Antonio would be permitted to keep her, officially, but she would never set foot on Wilcox property again after the 2 days elapsed. No stable, no hay, no veterinary access through the ranch's existing accounts. The Torres family would have to find a way to board and care for a recovering thoroughbred mare with the $900 they had already scraped together and whatever they could earn in the coming months. It was a solution that solved one crisis and created another. But as Antonio walked back to the hidden paddock where his son and the mare were waiting, he found that he was smiling. A thin, exhausted smile that Michael didn't recognize at first because he had never seen it before. It was the smile of a man who had spent his whole life making himself small and had just discovered, to his own amazement, that refusing to be invisible was an option after all. Dr. Vasquez arrived for the final lavage procedure on the 14th day and pronounced the mare's uterus clear of infection. The hormone therapy, a carefully calibrated regimen of gonadotropin-releasing hormone that cost nearly as much as the antibiotics but was covered under the university study, had successfully resolved the anovulatory follicles, and a follow-up ultrasound showed a healthy ovarian structure with evidence of normal follicular development for the first time in years. Midnight Sovereign was no longer barren. She was not only fertile, but had a uterine environment capable of sustaining a pregnancy to term. The mare that Charles Wilcox had thrown away for $800 was now, medically, worth more than any horse in his current breeding program, and he had signed away his claim in a fit of arrogance that would haunt him for the remainder of his career. But the Torres family still had 48 hours to move her, and they had nowhere to take her, and Michael could feel the clock ticking in his chest like a second heartbeat, louder with every passing hour. The 48 hours that Charles Wilcox had given them felt less like a window and more like a noose tightening 1 hour at a time. Antonio spent the first of those 2 days making phone calls to every boarding facility within 100 miles, starting with the large commercial stables and working his way down to the backyard operations that barely had enough grazing for the horses they already owned. The response was universal and crushing. No one had space on 48 hours' notice. No one was willing to take a horse with an ongoing medical treatment plan, regardless of Dr. Vasquez's written assurance that the mare was no longer contagious or unstable. And no one, not a single facility owner within the county lines, was willing to accept a horse that Charles Wilcox had personally cast out, because doing so would mean crossing a man whose influence ran deep enough to affect zoning permits, feed contracts, and veterinary referral networks. Charles hadn't just thrown the mare away. He had made sure, through the quiet channels of power that he had spent a lifetime cultivating, that no one else in his sphere would be brave enough to catch her. The second phone call Antonio made that morning was to Dr. Vasquez, not because he expected her to solve the boarding problem, but because he needed someone to confirm that the mare could survive transport if he was forced to take her somewhere far enough away that Charles's reach didn't extend. Dr. Vasquez said the mare was stable, that her recovery had been remarkable, and that she could probably handle a drive of several hours if the trailer was clean and the pace was steady. Then she paused, and the pause was the kind that meant the next sentence was going to break something open. She said she had been going through the mare's registration papers, the ones Charles had handed over in such a hurry that he hadn't bothered to check what was inside the folder. She said the mare's full registered name wasn't just Midnight Sovereign. It was Midnight Sovereign of Crestwood, and the Crestwood prefix was significant because it traced her lineage directly to a sire line that had produced 3 of the last 5 national champions in her division. She said the mare's bloodline alone, now that she was medically cleared for breeding, was worth somewhere between $70,000 and $90,000 on the open market. She said she had called a colleague at an equine genetics lab in Kentucky who had confirmed that Midnight Sovereign's dam line carried a rare combination of performance and conformation markers that made her one of the most valuable broodmares in the region if her fertility was intact. And then she said the thing that made Antonio's blood run cold. She said she had been legally required to update the mare's registration status with the Breed Association when the treatment concluded, and that update had triggered an automatic notification to the previous registered owner, Charles Wilcox. The realization landed like a physical blow. Charles didn't know yet. The 48-hour reprieve he had granted was based on the assumption that the mare was still a medical project, a charity case that would drain the Torres family's resources and disappear quietly from his property. He had no idea that the mare he had discarded for $800 was now, on paper, worth more than his entire current breeding stock combined. The moment he found out, the reprieve would evaporate. He would have every legal, financial, and personal incentive to reclaim her by any means necessary, and the fact that Antonio had no money, no lawyer, and no standing against a man who owned half the county meant that a fight over ownership would be over before it began. Michael had been listening to the whole conversation from the corner of the trailer, his back pressed against the thin aluminum wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. He was smart enough to understand the math. The mare was saved. The mare was valuable. And before any of that value could translate into security for his family or the horse he had risked everything to protect, Charles Wilcox was going to find out what he had thrown away. And when he did, everything the past 2 weeks had built would be swallowed by the machinery of his ego. The solution arrived from an unexpected direction. Michael, unable to sleep that night, had walked out to the hidden paddock where Midnight Sovereign was standing in the moonlight, her black coat turned silver by the glow. He had been talking to her again, the way he always did, telling her about the boarding problem and the registration and the terrible fear that Charles was going to take her back and sell her to a buyer who would treat her the way her previous handlers had, as a biological machine valued only for what she could produce. He had been talking loud enough that he didn't realize he was being overheard until a voice answered him from the darkness. It was a woman's voice, rough with age but steady, and it belonged to a person he knew only by sight and reputation. Her name was Eleanor Cross, and she owned the neighboring ranch to the west, a property that shared a fence line with the Wilcox operation but had existed in a state of mutual disregard for 40 years. Eleanor was 82 years old, a widow who had outlived 2 husbands and 3 business partners, and she had spent the past decade running a small rescue for retired draft horses that nobody else wanted. She had been walking her property line that night, a habit she kept even when the cold made her joints ache, and she had heard Michael's voice carrying across the fence. She had listened for 20 minutes before deciding to speak. She said she had room in her lower pasture, a 20-acre field with a run-in shed and a spring-fed trough, and she didn't care what Charles Wilcox thought or said or tried to do about it. She said she had been looking for a way to annoy him for 40 years, and this seemed like a better reason than most. Antonio met Eleanor the next morning and found a woman whose small frame and weathered skin concealed a will made of something harder than bone. She had been fighting the Wilcox family since before Charles was born, back when his father had tried to claim a strip of her land through an easement dispute that had dragged through the courts for 6 years and ended with Eleanor's lawyer producing a survey from 1881 that proved the Wilcox claim was fraudulent. The feud had gone quiet in recent decades, but it had never died, and Eleanor had been waiting for decades for an opportunity to remind the Wilcox family that their power had limits. She offered the Torres family a simple deal. The mare could stay in her lower pasture for as long as necessary, at no charge, and Eleanor would cover the cost of feed and basic care from her rescue fund. In exchange, Antonio would help her with the heavy work around her property, the fence repairs and hay hauling that her aging body could no longer manage alone. And if Charles tried anything, Eleanor would handle it. She had a lawyer in Denver who owed her 3 favors, and she had been saving the last one for a special occasion. Midnight Sovereign moved to the Cross Ranch that afternoon, walking the last mile on her own 4 legs, with Michael leading her halter rope and Antonio walking behind. The route took them off the paved roads and across a cattle track that cut through a corner of state land, a deliberate detour that avoided the main gates of the Wilcox property and the eyes of the foreman, who would certainly be watching. By sunset, the mare was standing in a green pasture beneath a stand of cottonwood trees, her head lowered to graze, her daughter still nothing but a possibility, waiting to be realized. Eleanor stood at the fence line and watched her with the satisfaction of a woman who had just added another chapter to a very long story of resistance. But even as the relief of the moment settled over them, Michael could feel the pressure of unfinished business pressing against the back of his mind. The mare was safe. The treatment was complete. The boarding was secured. But none of it would matter if the registration issue wasn't resolved. Charles Wilcox was still the registered owner on file with the Breed Association, and the transfer paperwork that should have been filed after the transaction was still sitting in a drawer in the ranch office, unsigned by Charles and unrecorded by the county. Until that document was executed, the mare belonged to Charles on paper, and paper was what mattered in court. Dr. Vasquez called again that weekend with an update that made the registration issue more urgent than ever. The notification to Charles had been delayed by a clerical error at the Breed Association, but the error had been caught, and the letter was going out in Monday's mail. Charles would know within the week that his worthless mare was worth a small fortune, and when he did, the first thing he would do was check the registration records. If they still showed him as the owner, he would have no incentive to sign the transfer. If anything, he would have every incentive to claim the mare had never been legally sold, to argue that the $800 had been a deposit rather than a purchase, to bury the Torres family in litigation until they ran out of money or will. Antonio needed that signature. He needed it before Charles found out what the mare was really worth, and the only way to get it was to walk into the ranch office and ask for it, face to face, knowing that Charles was about to leave for a horse auction in Texas and would be gone by Tuesday morning. The window was closing to a pinpoint. Antonio went to the ranch office on Sunday afternoon, the quietest hour of the week. when Charles was usually alone with his paperwork and his whiskey and the fading afternoon light. Michael went with him, despite his father's objection, because something in the boy had changed over the past 2 weeks. Something that no longer accepted waiting outside closed doors while other people decided his fate. They found Charles at his desk, exactly where they expected, but he was not alone. Garrett, the foreman, was standing at his shoulder with a stack of papers, and the two of them were studying something on the desk that Antonio couldn't see from the doorway. Charles looked up when they entered, and the expression on his face was not the casual disdain he had worn during their last conversation. It was something sharper, something that looked almost like anticipation. He had already opened his mail, and on the desk in front of him, printed on heavy paper with the Breed Association's gold seal, were the registration records that should have told him nothing until Monday morning. The clerical error had been caught, but it had also been overcorrected. The notification had been sent by priority mail, and it had arrived on Saturday while Charles was home recovering from his trip to Denver. He had read it. He knew everything. Charles leaned back in his chair and smiled the smile of a man who had just been handed a winning hand in a game he had thought he had already folded. He said he was glad Antonio had come by, because it saved him the trouble of sending someone to fetch him. He said he had been reviewing the paperwork on the Mare's sale, and it appeared that several critical documents had never been completed, including the bill of sale and the transfer of registration. Without those documents, the Mare was still legally his property, and he had decided to void the transaction entirely. He would return Antonio's $800 with interest, and the Mare would be returned to his breeding program, where she belonged. He said it with the calm of a man who knew the law was on his side and the pocket depth to bury a stable hand in legal fees if he tried to object. Antonio stood in the doorway of that office and felt the floor drop out from under his life. Everything he had sacrificed, the emptied savings, the risk to his job, the defiance of a man who could destroy his family with a single phone call, all of it was slipping through his fingers because a piece of paper had never been signed. But before he could speak, before he could find the words that would almost certainly fail anyway, Michael stepped forward. He was 12 years old, 100 pounds in wet clothing, a boy whose only weapon was the truth he had been collecting like ammunition for weeks. He looked Charles Wilcox directly in the eyes, and he said the thing no one in that room expected to hear. He said his father might not have the bill of sale, but he had something better. He had the recording. The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fill the room like a siren. Charles's smile flickered, just for a moment. He asked what recording. Michael explained, with the steady calm of a child who had been underestimated his entire life and had learned to turn that underestimation into a weapon, that on the day his father had stopped the trailer, Charles had called from Denver and given verbal authorization for the Mare to be released to Antonio for $800. That call had been on speakerphone, and Michael, who had been standing near the barn office door, had recorded it on a cheap digital recorder he had bought at a garage sale for $5, a device he carried everywhere because he had learned that the world was full of people who said things they later denied. The recording captured Charles's voice, clear and unmistakable, saying the words "she's his for $800 and I don't care what you do with her." It also captured the trailer driver acknowledging the transaction, Doc Harlan's voice in the background, and the foreman confirming that the money had been handed over. It was a verbal contract, and in Colorado, verbal contracts for livestock sales were enforceable if there was evidence of offer, acceptance, and consideration. The recording was evidence of all three. Charles's expression shifted, slowly the way a building shifts before it collapses. He asked if the boy was bluffing. Michael reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out the recorder, a small silver rectangle with a cracked screen and a red light that blinked when he pressed the play button. Charles's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable, the words from that Tuesday morning preserved in durable digital memory. When the clip ended, Michael pressed stop and put the recorder back in his pocket. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The confrontation that followed lasted another hour. But its outcome had been decided in the moment the recording played. Charles tried to pivot, to argue that the verbal contract was invalid because the mare's value had changed, that he would sue anyway, that he would tie the matter up in court until the Torres family ran out of money, regardless of who was right. But Eleanor Cross's lawyer, whose name Michael had memorized from the conversation at the fence line, turned out to be exactly the kind of attorney who specialized in messy livestock disputes. And a phone call to Denver established that the firm would take the case on contingency if it came to litigation. Charles, cornered by evidence he couldn't dispute and a legal opponent he didn't want to face, signed the transfer papers at 7 o'clock that Sunday evening, his pen pressing hard enough to tear the paper. Midnight Sovereign was officially, irrevocably, the property of the Torres family, and there was nothing Charles Wilcox could do about it, except seethe in silence and wait for an opportunity to make someone pay for the humiliation. He didn't wait long. The next morning, Antonio arrived at the Wilcox stables to find his locker emptied, his tools boxed, and a termination notice pinned to the barn door. The reason listed was insubordination, a word broad enough to be unassailable in the at-will employment framework of the state. The housing that came with the job, the trailer where Michael had grown up, was tied to his employment. The family had 30 days to vacate. Charles had lost the mare, but he still had the power to make sure the people who had humiliated him lost everything else. The Torres family had won the battle for Midnight Sovereign, but the war against the man they had embarrassed was only beginning, and the first casualty was the roof over their heads. The termination notice pinned to the barn door sent a tremor through the ranch that reached further than Charles Wilcox ever intended. Antonio Torres had been invisible for 6 years, a quiet man doing quiet work, and his abrupt firing for insubordination would normally have been forgotten by the next morning's coffee. But Garrett, eager to demonstrate his loyalty to the boss, had made a critical mistake. He had told the other hands why Antonio was being let go. He had told them about the mare, about the recording, about the 12-year-old boy who had outmaneuvered Charles Wilcox in his own office. Within hours, the story had traveled through the bunkhouse, across the paddocks, into the feed room where the grooms gossiped in Spanish while they measured grain. By nightfall, everyone on the ranch knew that the lowest-paid man in the operation had forced the owner to sign over a mare worth more than his entire salary for the rest of his life, and that the owner's response was to make the man homeless for the crime of being right. The backlash was slow to form, but impossible to stop. 3 stable hands quit the following week, not out of loyalty to Antonio, but out of the creeping realization that they worked for a man who would discard them as easily as he discarded a champion mare. 2 of them took jobs at the Cross Ranch, where Eleanor was quietly assembling a small staff to help manage the expanding rescue operation. Doc Harlan, whose conscience had been gnawing at him since the day he handed Michael that envelope, stopped returning Charles's calls for routine herd checks and began referring the ranch to a colleague in the next county. And Dr. Vasquez, who had been compiling the mare's case data for the university's study, included in her final report a detailed timeline of the Wilcox Ranch's breeding management practices, a timeline that the study's peer reviewers flagged as an example of how not to manage a broodmare program. The report would be published in the Journal of Equine Reproduction 6 months later, and the Wilcox name would appear in its footnotes as a case study in diagnostic failure. But the most immediate consequence was the one that saved the Torres family from the 30-day clock that Charles had set ticking. Eleanor Cross had been waiting for an excuse to expand her operation, and the arrival of a suddenly unemployed stable hand with a champion mare and a son who had proven himself smarter than the entire Wilcox management structure was not an excuse. It was a gift from a universe she had learned to trust. She offered Antonio a permanent position managing the rescue horses, a salary that was modest but real, and the use of a small 2-bedroom cabin on the northern edge of her property, a structure that had once housed seasonal ranch hands and had been sitting empty for 5 years. It had a wood stove, a sagging porch, and a view of the mountains that stretched uninterrupted to the horizon. To Michael, who had spent his entire life in a single wide trailer that rattled when the wind blew, it felt like a kingdom. They moved the second week of November, hauling their belongings in the same trailer that had nearly carried Midnight Sovereign to the slaughterhouse. The mare watched from her pasture as they unloaded boxes and furniture, her ears pricked forward with the same quiet attention she had shown during those long weeks of treatment. She was 9 months removed from her last failed breeding cycle, fully recovered, her coat gleaming with the health that proper care had restored. Dr. Vasquez had cleared her for breeding the following spring, and the question of which stallion to pair her with had become the central puzzle of the family's new life. The decision would determine not just the quality of the foal, but the financial future of everyone involved. A good match could produce a horse worth tens of thousands. A great match could produce something that would rewrite the record books. The stallion they chose, after weeks of research and a consultation with the equine genetics lab that had confirmed the mare's rare bloodline markers, was a black Hanoverian named Valiant's Thunder, a 17-hand powerhouse who had won 3 national dressage titles before being retired to stud. His breeding fee was $15,000, a sum that Antonio couldn't begin to approach, but Eleanor had a different kind of currency. She had known Valiant's Thunder's owner for 40 years, a woman named Patricia, who had boarded her first horse at Eleanor's stable when they were both young and broke. Eleanor called in a favor that had been accumulating compound interest for 4 decades, and Patricia agreed to waive the stud fee in exchange for the first right of refusal on the foal at market value. It was a deal that protected everyone's interests while costing no one anything up front. The kind of arrangement that only existed in a world where relationships mattered more than money. The breeding took place on a crisp morning in early April, with Dr. Kissme Vasquez overseeing the artificial insemination procedure in the small barn that Eleanor had converted into a temporary veterinary suite. 2 weeks later, the ultrasound confirmed what everyone had been holding their breath to see. Midnight Sovereign was carrying a single foal, implanted perfectly, with a strong fetal heartbeat that pulsed across the screen like a promise. Michael watched the image flicker on the monitor and felt something settle in his chest that had been unanchored since the day he watched the trailer almost carry her away. She was not barren. She had never been barren. She had been failed by people who couldn't be bothered to look deeper, and now she was going to prove, in the most undeniable way possible, exactly what that failure had almost cost. The pregnancy progressed through the spring and into the summer with the smooth regularity that Dr. Vasquez had predicted. Midnight Sovereign grew round and content, her belly swelling to proportions that made the ranch hands whistle when they passed her pasture. She was carrying large, which the ultrasounds confirmed was a colt of exceptional bone structure, and as the months passed, the anticipation that had started as a quiet hope grew into something that attracted attention from far beyond the Cross property. Word had spread through the breeding community about the mare's story, the misdiagnosis, the boy, the recording, the firing, the improbable rescue. People who had never heard of Michael Torres or Eleanor Cross began driving up the gravel road to see the mare who had outsmarted Charles Wilcox, and they left with stories that they carried to shows and auctions across the region. By the time the foal was due, the narrative had taken on a life of its own, a piece of equestrian folklore that made Charles Wilcox's name a punchline in barns from Colorado to Kentucky. The foal arrived on a moonless night in late February, 11 months after the breeding, with Dr. Vasquez and Michael in attendance, and Antonio holding the mare's halter rope. The birth was uncomplicated, a swift and fluid delivery that deposited a dark, wet colt onto the clean straw in a rush of membrane and life. He was enormous, nearly 140 pounds at birth, with the same obsidian coat as his mother and a single white blaze that ran from his forehead to his muzzle like a streak of lightning. His legs were impossibly long, his chest deep, his eyes bright with the alert curiosity that marked the best of his sire's bloodline. Dr. Vasquez examined him with the careful efficiency of a clinician who had seen thousands of foals, but when she looked up at Michael, her expression was not clinical at all. She said the colt was exceptional. She said his conformation scores, even at birth, were in the top 2% of her career. She said he was going to be a champion. Michael knelt in the straw beside the foal, his hand resting on its damp flank, and felt the small chest rise and fall with the rhythm of a life that should never have existed. A life that had been saved by the thinnest of margins and the stubbornness of a boy who refused to look away. They named the colt Midnight's Reckoning. The name was Michael's idea, and when Eleanor heard it, she laughed so hard she had to sit down. It was perfect, she said, a name that would appear in show programs and breeding registries for years to come. A quiet reminder to everyone who knew the story of exactly what had been reckoned. The colt grew with the explosive velocity of a young horse whose genetics and nutrition had aligned perfectly, his conformation tightening, his gaits developing the floating suspension that marked his sire's dressage champions. By the time he was weaned at 6 months, he was already attracting informal offers from breeders who had heard the rumors and driven out to see him for themselves. One offer, from a Kentucky operation that had produced Olympic medalists, topped $60,000. Antonio turned it down without hesitation. He had not saved Midnight Sovereign to sell her first foal before the horse had a chance to prove what the world had nearly lost. The moment of proof arrived the following summer at the Rocky Mountain Breeders' Classic, a 3-day show that drew entries from 15 states and served as an unofficial preview of the national championship season. Charles Wilcox had been entering horses in the Breeders' Classic for 20 years, and his entries typically dominated the conformation and young horse classes. His reputation and his checkbook, ensuring that his horses received the benefit of every doubt from judges who knew which side of their bread was buttered. This year, Charles had entered his strongest string in a decade, including a 2-year-old filly he had been touting in the trade press as his best prospect since Midnight Sovereign herself. The filly was entered in the Young Horse Championship, a class that evaluated conformation, movement, and potential for future performance, and Charles had been telling anyone who would listen that she was unbeatable. Michael entered Midnight's Reckoning in the same class, not out of strategic calculation, but because the colt's training had advanced far enough that Dr. Vasquez and Eleanor both agreed he was ready. The entry fee was $200, which Michael paid from a savings account he had started the day Midnight Sovereign was officially transferred to the family, a fund fed by small contributions from Eleanor, from Dr. Vasquez, from the rescue volunteers who had watched the story unfold and wanted to be part of its resolution. When the show office posted the entry list, and Charles saw the name Midnight's Reckoning registered under the ownership of Michael Torres, he laughed out loud in the hospitality tent and told the people around him that the boy was about to learn the difference between a backyard pet and a real competition horse. His laughter carried across the grounds, confident and dismissive, the laughter of a man who still believed that power and money were the same thing. The Young Horse Championship took place on the final afternoon of the show, in the main arena beneath a sky so blue it looked manufactured. The grandstands were full, the rail lined with breeders and trainers and the kind of serious buyers who traveled to these events with their checkbooks already open. Charles's filly entered the ring with the polished confidence of a horse who had been professionally prepared by a team of handlers whose only job was to make her look immaculate. She moved well, her gaits clean, her demeanor composed, and the crowd's applause confirmed what Charles had been telling everyone. She was going to win. Then, Midnight's Reckoning entered the ring, led by a 12-year-old boy whose hand on the lead rope was steadier than it had any right to be, and the crowd went silent. The colt moved across the arena with the natural suspension that had been evident from birth, but now refined by months of careful groundwork, his black coat gleaming with the same obsidian depth as his mother's. He stood with a presence that made the other young horses look like they were still playing at being adults, the white blaze on his face catching the sun like a signal. The judges, whose attention had been professional and attentive for every previous entry, leaned forward in their chairs. They watched the colt trot across the diagonal with the floating stride that separated good horses from great ones. They watched Michael halt him in the center of the ring, the boy's small frame perfectly still, the colt's ears pricked with calm attention. And when the scores were announced, the filly that Charles had called unbeatable placed second. Midnight's Reckoning placed first, earning a score that was the highest recorded in the class's history. The trophy was handed to Michael Torres as the crowd rose to its feet, and somewhere in the grandstand, Charles Wilcox watched with a face that had gone the color of old ash. The aftermath moved faster than anyone expected. The win at the Breeders' Classic triggered a cascade of interest from national-level buyers, and within a month, a syndicate of dressage breeders had offered $200,000 for a controlling share of the colt's future breeding rights, with the Torres family retaining ownership and management authority. The offer was accepted, not because they needed the money, but because the deal ensured that Midnight's Reckoning would stand at stud at a premier facility, his bloodline preserved, and his name elevated to the highest tier of the breed. The contract included a clause, insisted upon by Michael, that any mares sent to the colt for breeding would be required to undergo a full reproductive soundness examination, the same kind of examination that Doc Harlan had never bothered to perform. It was a small clause, a footnote in a 20-page legal document, but it meant that no mare would ever be dismissed as barren on this colt's watch without a thorough investigation of the real problem. Midnight Sovereign entered retirement the following spring, spending her days in the same grassy pasture beneath the cottonwood trees where she had been taken after the rescue. She was bred one more time to the same stallion, and the resulting filly was sold to a breeding program in Virginia for a sum that secured the financial future of the Torres family for a decade. But the mare's value to Michael had never been measured in dollars. She had been the catalyst for everything that followed. The proof that looking closely at the things the world dismisses can reveal treasures that the lazy and the arrogant walk past every day. Eleanor Cross lived to see all of it, her long feud with the Wilcox family ending in a victory she savored more than any courtroom triumph. Charles Wilcox's breeding operation, already weakened by the departures of key staff and the quiet damage to his reputation, suffered a further blow when the Journal of Equine Reproduction published Dr. Vasquez's case study, naming his ranch as the source of the misdiagnosis that had nearly cost a champion mare her life. No lawsuit was ever filed, because no lawsuit was necessary. The market delivered its own verdict, and by the time Midnight's Reckoning's first crop of foals hit the ground 3 years later, Charles Wilcox had sold his remaining breeding stock and retired to a condo in Scottsdale. His name fading from the show programs and the auction catalogs, and the memories of an industry that moved on faster than he had ever believed possible. Michael Torres, at 15, was the youngest owner of a national champion in the breed's recorded history. But the accomplishment that he valued most had happened in the quiet of a barn on a winter night, when a colt took its first breath, and he knelt in the straw beside it, his hand on its flank, feeling the small heart beat against his palm. That moment was the end of one story and the beginning of another, a story that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't yet imagine, touching veterinarians and breeders and stable hands and anyone who had ever been told, by someone who wasn't paying attention, that a living thing wasn't worth saving. The story of Midnight Sovereign could have ended at that auction in Nuevo Laredo. One more champion discarded by a system that measures worth in profit margins and discards anything that fails to deliver on schedule. The fact that it didn't, that a 12-year-old boy with no money and no standing managed to reverse a verdict that everyone around him accepted as final, forces a question that goes far beyond one horse in one pasture in Colorado. How much value do we throw away every day because we're too busy, too certain, or too proud to look twice? In veterinary medicine alone, up to 60% of mares labeled as Barren are suffering from treatable conditions. That number isn't just a statistic. It's a mountain of wasted potential, lives erased by assumptions that no one bothered to test. And beyond horses, in workplaces and schools and families and every corner of human life, the same dynamic plays out. Someone decides something is broken and unworthy of repair, and the people around them nod because it's easier than asking questions. What Michael Torres did wasn't magic. He paid attention. He trusted what he saw when it contradicted what he was told. He refused to let someone else's laziness determine the fate of a living creature he knew deserved better. That's the part of the story that belongs to anyone who hears it. Not the champion bloodlines or the show ring triumphs or the six-figure breeding syndicates, but the simple, stubborn act of looking closely at something the world had already given up on and saying, "I think you're wrong." Because sometimes the difference between worthless and priceless is just one person who cares enough to notice what everyone else missed. The Torres family still lives on the Cross Ranch, surrounded by rescue horses and the grandchildren Eleanor never expected to have. Midnight Sovereign lived to be 27, outlasting every horse Charles Wilcox ever bred. And her last years were spent in the same pasture where Michael first led her after the rescue. A green field beneath cottonwood trees that turn gold every autumn. The reproductive soundness clause Michael insisted on has been adopted into the standard contracts of 3 major breeding registries. A quiet policy change that has probably saved hundreds of mares from the slaughterhouse by forcing handlers to rule out treatable conditions before labeling a horse as barren. Doc Harlan never returned to equine practice, but he wrote Michael a letter before he retired, saying that the boy had taught him something his veterinary degree never did, that the most dangerous words in medicine are "I already know what that is." Doctor Elena Vasquez now runs the reproductive clinic at Colorado State, and every semester she tells her students the story of Midnight Sovereign as a reminder that a proper breeding soundness exam isn't a luxury, it's an obligation. Eleanor Cross passed away 2 years ago at the age of 87, leaving the entire rescue operation to the Torres family in a will she had rewritten the day after watching Charles Wilcox sign those transfer papers. Her feud with the Wilcox name lasted more than half a century, and she won it in the end. Not with litigation, but with the quiet persistence of a woman who understood that some battles are fought best by simply outlasting the enemy. As for Charles Wilcox, the condo in Scottsdale keeps him comfortable. But he doesn't go to horse shows anymore. His name, once a fixture in the winner's circle at every major event in the region, has become a cautionary tale that breeders tell new owners over dinner at the end of long competition days. Not because he was cruel, exactly, but because he was incurious, and incuriosity at the scale of power is indistinguishable from cruelty for the creatures caught beneath it. The industry moved on, as industries do, and the horses that carry his old client's silks now run under different bloodlines and different training philosophies, beneficiaries of a quiet shift in expectation that began the moment a boy's voice recording played back a man's casual dismissal and turned it into the evidence that saved a champion's life. If this story meant something to you, let us know in the comments. Tell us about a time you or someone you know gave a second chance to something everyone else had written off. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story, because we tell the ones that could have been forgotten, the ones that almost didn't make it, the ones that remind us all that the value of a life isn't determined by the people too busy to look deeper. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.